In this chapter, we'll discuss interviewing. So the objectives, being able to discuss the purpose of different kinds of interviews, such as a food and nutrition interview and a pre-employment interview. Explain the conditions necessary for effective interviewing. Identify the parts of an interview and what should be included in each. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of various types of questions. Develop a list of appropriate questions for a food and nutrition interview and sequence them. Identify the different types of responses to an interviewee's remarks, and use techniques of interviewing and conduct a food and nutrition interview. So again, looking at what is an interview. So again, this is not an interrogation. You're not just there to ask question after question after question and write information down. So it's a guided communication process between two people. And again, the big thing, and especially I know the RD exam and some other exams have asked this, is it has a predetermined purpose. Now in our case, we're sharing, obtaining, and verifying information. And again, it's going to consist of asking and answering of questions. We want to make sure, of course, with our interview skills that we're collecting accurate information. So this is especially important when an interview is part of a nutrition assessment. Again, our assessment and interpretation of the data is only as good as our information is accurate. And again, we want to make sure that we're maintaining an environment that is conducive to full disclosure. So again, making sure our patients are comfortable and building that rapport so they give us a complete and honest response. So looking at conducting nutrition interviews, we need to be aware of the patient's current dietary practices. And so we want to be able to identify nutrition-related problems and their nutrition status. So again, we want to be able to look at how their intake compares to their needs, which is nutrition status, and again, any problems they may be experiencing. So we want to be able to help identify possible alternatives, and again, providing baseline data. So again, if we're especially looking at moving forward, again, we have to have something to measure our progress against, and developing rapport with the client. So again, developing that level of comfortability where they are willing to be honest, right, and give us truthful information so that we have an accurate assessment. Some key pieces of information to obtain about a client's consumption of food includes their intake of foods, so what foods and the portion sizes of those foods, timing, location, and patterns. So again, how many meals are eaten out, at what time, are the times regular from day to day. Looking at cues to eating. So again, is this hunger? Is this emotional eating? Is this just because it's part of the schedule? Looking at any nutrition or herbal supplements they may be using. Are they currently following or have they previously followed any diet or any dietary restrictions? And do they have any intolerances or allergies? We also want to look at the bigger picture of their knowledge of nutrition and health. So what are their current beliefs about nutrition? What's their level of involvement in self-monitoring and self-care practices? So what do they currently engage in? Have they had any previous nutrition counseling and education? And so again, looking at, we know with self-efficacy, have they been successful in the past? Were they not successful? And again, their current readiness to learn. While not directly related to nutrition, again, this is obviously part of health and it ties together. So we want to make sure that we're getting information on their current physical activity and exercise. So again, this is things like their activity patterns, their sedentary time. So again, do they play video games? Do they watch TV? What are they doing? And then if they do engage in exercise, with what frequency, how intense, and for how long are they exercising? And I would also include mode, which is, are they doing cycling, running, walking, swimming, resistance training? And again, depending on your level of knowledge of appropriateness, again, is this a safe form of physical activity for this patient? Again, it may not be easy to talk about, but we also want to find ways to build rapport and find out about food availability. So again, looking at things like food planning, purchasing, and preparation abilities. And so again, who does the purchasing? So for example, and this is typically what you see, for example, in older male clients, is they have very little involvement in meal planning. and this is they're just a product of their time, in which case their wife is involved in all of the cooking and purchasing and preparation. So they really need to be a part of that planning process if we're going to change nutrition habits. Looking at food safety, looking at if there are any participation in food and nutrition assistance programs, or again, if they would be appropriate for those programs, and the degree of the patient's food insecurity. So again, if they have limited access, again, this has a very different type of intervention than reducing intake of saturated fat, sodium, cholesterol, etc. So there are several different ways that we can do a dietary assessment, and so we will be practicing some of those methods in class. So there's dietary records, there's spoken or printed dietary recalls, there's food frequency questionnaires, and the biggest thing, so especially being 2020, is there are computer applications to help us improve accuracy. And the other big thing is that, similar to when you brush your teeth a lot before you go to the dentist, no one wants to admit to the dietitian that they've been eating McDonald's, Burger King, etc. So when they interact with a computer and it's self-guided, they're more likely to be honest, so we get a little bit better accuracy and validity. So some of the specific information you want to get during a nutrition interview includes foods and beverages, as well as their portion size, and then also asking about how the food is prepared. So again, is it baked or fried or grilled? Looking at things like snacks or supplements. Again, we talked about as time and place of eating. Again, are they eating meals out of the home or in the home, or what ratio? Looking at alcoholic beverage intake. And again, weekend meals, as we fully expect that weekend meals will be different from weekday meals. Now again, the book talks about several different methods, so we've talked about food frequency questionnaires, 24-hour recalls, etc. Some of the issues, of course, is that the 24-hour period may not be typical, so if somebody was particularly stressed or worried before going to see the dietitian, they may have skipped a meal. Or if you're recalling a weekend, they may have had higher intake than normal. So again, we know that weekends, for most people, differ from weekdays. So this is why you'll often see, quote-unquote, a 3-day food record or journal with at least 2 weekdays and 1 weekend day. We know that there are seasonal variations, so the infamous comfort food, things like beef stew, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, right, being very much quote-unquote comfort foods in the winter, and so people are eating more fresh fruits and vegetables in the spring and summer. Many people are unable to accurately judge portion sizes, even professionals. So one of the big things that humans have is issues with depth perception. So when you look into a bowl, it's very difficult looking above a bowl to actually determine how much food you've put into it. So people are, and even professionals, are really bad at judging portion sizes. And so one of the things I've actually recommended to clients is go to the dollar store and just buy 5 $1 packs of measuring cups and put them in everything, just to make it easier. Patients may have poor memory, they may lack motivation to put their best effort forth into the recall, they may have literacy issues, and again, we of course see underreporting, again, as no one wants to admit all of their food intake to a dietitian. Now again, a little bit different from traditional counseling is employee counseling, or in this case, pre-employment interviews is a specific skill. So this book consistently talks about counseling and using counseling skills for dietitians as managers. So in the case of a pre-employment interview, the goal is to assess the credentials and skills of the applicant for the job. Now you'll notice that what it does do is an interview should be pre-planned with structured questions. And so this is twofold. So one of those purposes is to make sure that we're getting a fair assessment of each applicant. So we want to ask them all the same information. The other, and the reason why you do not want to deviate from these questions, has to do with protected classes. And so if you violate that and ask questions about protected classes, again, that has legal ramifications at the federal level. So again, you will see especially large companies are very careful with the information a manager is allowed to ask potential employees. And what we have seen is a movement towards behavioral interviews and competency-based hiring, where, again, they would say, if you were in this situation, what would you do? Or give us an example of something in the past where you had an altercation with someone beneath you, how did you handle the situation? So again, what they want to see is, instead of asking the classic, why do you think we should hire you? Instead, they want to see that you actually have these skills for the job. And again, that's why you're seeing this move towards competency-based, which is, do you actually have these skills to perform the job? And so the way that interview is conducted, right, we have these stages. So you would bring the applicant in, you explain the process, what you're going to be doing, what you're trying to determine. You then have the questioning by the interviewer. The interviewee gives their responses. So again, they would ask them, what about this situation? Or are you trained in this? How would you handle this situation? And then after all the pre-planned questions have been answered, you then have a closing and you provide the applicant with information on the next steps and a timeline. And so again, if you've ever had this happen to you incorrectly, I'm sure you've been very frustrated. But a good manager and a well-organized company would tell you, hey, we're going to be conducting interviews the rest of the week. We'll let you know our decision by next Monday or Tuesday. And again, you would be contacted by HR department and they would discuss X, Y, and Z with you, right? So that's the kind of information that as a manager you should have and be prepared to give potential applicants. Next, the chapter moves back into looking at conditions that facilitate interviews or what makes the process easier. So depending on the type of interview, whether this be hiring or interviewing a patient, you want to define the purpose. So you would explain, hey, I'm here today to get some more information to see how I can best help you. Or if a manager, again, we're trying to determine your qualifications for this role. Again, you want to make sure that you're noticing verbal and nonverbal behaviors. So again, is the patient comfortable or is the employee comfortable? Again, based on their language, are they disinterested? This more plays a role, for example, in inpatient clients. You want to listen carefully and build rapport. Especially in an inpatient setting, you have a very limited amount of time to build that trust and rapport with a client. You want to make sure that you provide privacy and avoid interruptions. And this can be difficult, especially inpatient. So again, when you have, for example, people coming to collect blood work or provide meds, it can be very difficult if they have rooms that are only split by a curtain, in which case you would want to use an appropriate tone of voice, right? You don't need to be shouting the patient's private personal information. Again, if you're doing this in an outpatient setting, of course you would design your office appropriately, right? You would make sure that all phones are turned off, that your primary phone, for example, if you had an office phone, would be muted. And again, how you arrange the physical area, things you should be aware of. So for example, I'm a rather large male. Again, I would not want a client to feel trapped in my office. And so you'll notice that even if you look at our office spaces on campus, again, it's how you set the desk. Does somebody feel trapped in the room with you? Does somebody feel more comfortable? Is there enough physical space, etc.? You want to make sure that you have emotional objectivity. Again, counseling can be a very emotional process. Again, considering the personal context of the respondent. And again, I know it's very, very difficult because, again, typically when we're conducting interviews, we're looking to gain information as part of our assessment. So you need to be aware of the amount of note-taking that you are completing. So if you are taking notes, explain why and what they're for. Again, the big concern is that the patient may think you're disinterested and not listening if you're looking down and taking notes constantly. So if you are able to maintain eye contact and use shorthand or some other method to record the information that you needed, but again, still being involved in the conversation and showing that you're attentive and listening. Next, the chapter discusses the parts of an interview. And so what I like about this is it's, in my opinion, pretty easy to remember, as it's very much like the 5-paragraph essays that you wrote in high school, which is you have an introduction or an opening, you have the body, and you have the closing. Now again, you have different tasks that occur in these 3 portions, but it's a pretty logical transition. So you have the opening where you have the introduction and overview. So again, who you are, what this counseling session is about, what we're going to be discussing today. Again, the goal is to establish rapport. So again, it's that level of comfortability. And what you'll notice is that some patients take more time to build rapport. And so if people just need to have that chit chat about your day, what's the process that led you to come here, again, that may take away from the body or the therapy time, but sometimes it's needed to make sure that clients are comfortable enough to open up and actually have a productive session during the actual body portion. So then in the second portion, the exploration or the body, Again, this is where you're going to really be gathering the information with questions, and we'll talk about the specific types of questions coming up. You can further explore problems or thoughts and feelings based on the information that's provided and continue to build rapport. Now, there's a great example on page 63 in the text of how an interview might flow. And so the biggest thing is that it will take time, and I can just tell you that in my initial interviewing experience, I was very uncomfortable working with clients. But it's not an interrogation, it's an interview or a conversation. And so it's finding those natural transitions from what you were eating to then what were you drinking with those meals? What did you have for dessert after those meals? Do you do it how, do you just jump right into exercise? Do you somehow find a way, how does exercise get brought up? But again, it's part of building that skill set of getting that information from the client without just saying, what'd you eat for breakfast? What'd you eat for lunch? Did you do any exercise? What'd you have for dinner? What'd you have for dessert? Do you have any food allergies? How tall are you? Right? Again, you're not interrogating them. It should have a flow to it. And then you have the closing, which again, this is your classic wrap-up. You express appreciation. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you providing me with this information. It's going to help me better meet your needs. So again, you want to review the purpose. Again, do you have any questions for me? Is there anything I can answer for you? And when am I going to follow up with you? So is somebody from the nutrition department going to come and follow up? Are you getting a referral to an outpatient counselor? If I am the outpatient counselor, do I want to see you back in 2 weeks? So on and so forth. Okay, so you've told me I'm supposed to ask these people questions, but how do you actually ask those questions? So here are the different types of questions. Now I would make a note card and make sure I understood each of these different types. So you have open questions, closed, primary, secondary, probing, neutral, and leading. So open questions are broad, and the idea is that they give the interviewee the control, right? So the patient or client controls the direction of the conversation. So this allows people to tell a story, specifically their story, so they're going to volunteer the information they would like to. This is less threatening, right? This doesn't have that interrogation feel of you just provide an answer, right? You get to explain your story, and what you'll notice is that what the client emphasizes and chooses to speak about is what they think is important. Now the problem is that we may also collect unnecessary information. So people will start giving you lots of details. And again, either they don't know what information they're trying to provide, or they're trying to stall from talking about something that is going to be more stressful to them. You then have your closed questions, which again, depending on your context, can be good or bad. So again, this limits your answers. When I ask you for a very specific thing, such as, how much do you weigh? How tall are you? What did you eat for this meal? Now this does limit the answers, right? You don't get to tell your story, what you came in for, what's inspired this change, what you're thinking about, but it does give the interviewer more control. So especially if you're looking at, if you need a specific piece of information, if we're looking at a specific time, in an inpatient setting, you're going to use more closed questions because of the nature of the job. Again, you're going to have quicker answers, but information may be incomplete. So what you can also use closed-ended questions for, though, is to verify information. So if you want to check the accuracy of height, weight, allergies, I would just wanted to clarify something with you, right? Again, it's going to typically be a closed question. You then have your primary questions, which introduce new topics, or they change the focus or topic. So if you're, like I said, using a funnel or an umbrella, your primary questions are going to be that overarching theme. So again, this is like exercise. That's a primary question. So let's talk about your physical activity. And then we'll talk about our secondary questions. Or a primary question is, let's talk about what you usually eat. So this leads us to our secondary questions. So these are our follow-up questions. So again, we had our primary questions, which were our topics. These are things like physical activity. These are things like food intake. So then we have our follow-up, which is our secondary. So this is what type of physical activity, how often. These can also be used to help obtain further information or explanation. that the primary questions failed to elicit. So if I kind of thought the patient would bring something up on their own and they don't, I can follow up with secondary questions to get additional information. We then have our probing questions, which is a subcategory of secondary questions. And so these have a specific purpose where we're going to be probing for additional information. So these are asking clients to clarify partial responses or to continue. And so you heard these before. This is the classic, well, can you tell me more about this? Or can you go into a little more detail? Can you explain this to me again? Right, you're asking for clarification or to get additional information. And so next we'll take a look at how questions can be classified. So we have neutral questions and leading questions. And so we'll talk about the difference. So neutral questions are preferred to leading questions. And this is one of the biggest skill sets that needs to be worked on if you want to pursue a career in counseling, as it's very difficult to not ask leading questions, especially if we're looking at how interviews are conducted. So a neutral question allows the respondent to decide the answer, and you will actually get more accurate answers. So again, this is looking at those very open questions that are very neutral. What we want to be careful of is not asking leading questions, as these will direct the respondent towards one answer, but they are going to reveal the bias of the interviewer. So for example, when you actually look at how a food recall is conducted, you don't start with, what did you eat for breakfast? Again, I'm assuming that you eat breakfast. The client may think that I, as the dietitian, expect, ooh, if you're going to be following a healthy eating plan, you should be eating breakfast, so you better come up with something. Whereas instead, what I'm really trying to find out is, what did you eat first for the day? Right? Which gives the client much more time, and they may have not eaten until lunchtime. And so then they would explain, well, the first thing I ate was this and this at this time, right? I can ask for probing questions and clarify what time was that, how did you prepare it, etc. But if I start off with, what did you eat for breakfast? Or if I say, how often do you work out? As opposed to, right, keeping it more open, looking at talking about physical activity, what does that mean to you? Do you, again, it's very hard to not ask, how much do you do, without asking a leading question. So again, this is a very difficult and bad habit that people can get into. So again, one of the things we've said we need to be careful of is directives, which is questions that are asked as a statement or a directive. So this is again when questions start to get that interrogative feel. They're in rapid fire succession. They're very closed. They don't really let the clients talk. And so instead we want to rephrase questions. So for example, how has your diet been going? Or we can say things like, I'd be interested in hearing about, as opposed to, did you follow your diet? How much did you exercise? Why didn't you exercise more? And we'll talk about the problems with, again, why some of those questions are wrong upcoming. So again, it's not interrogation, and we want to make sure that the interview has a conversational tone to it, right? We're exchanging information, we're exploring things, and again, it's a fine line, especially in an inpatient setting where, again, you are on a limited time. Now looking at general concepts when it comes to sequencing an interview or how you would ask your questions. So I typically use a funnel, which is going from a very broad topic to specific. Now again, this is how you would ask your question. So if I asked about diet, just what do you eat? Very broad. What do you eat at this meal? Narrower. How did you cook this food at this meal? Very specific. You can also use an inverted funnel where you go from limited, so you can ask a very, very specific question, to then more broad topics or how they can relate to each other. You can then also use the tunnel format, which is questions on different topics. So for example, if we talked about lifestyle factors that affect cardiovascular disease, technically that's still our larger umbrella, but we could be asking things like alcohol intake, tobacco use, food, physical activity, where again, they're kind of related to each other, but not really, right? They're really very separate topics, right? We didn't go from food, meal, specific food, cooking method. We went, do you use alcohol? Do you use tobacco, right? Boom, boom, very separate topics. Now, it's really hard to do this, especially because we've been trained as nutrition science. So we're always curious as to mechanisms, right? So we always want to know why something happens. The problem is, and it's incredibly hard to do this, do not use why questions with patients. The problem is that they can sound very disapproving with displeasure or building mistrust, and they can provoke defensive feelings, even if you mean them completely innocently. So we're thinking the patient made a diet plan, the patient didn't follow through, and we're saying, well, I want to ask an open-ended question. So, well, why do you think that didn't happen? And so instead, what they're going to hear is this disapproval of, well, I failed to follow my diet, the dietitian's mad at me. We may just be genuinely curious into the process of, well, do you think it was your shopping? Do you think it was the stress of the cooking? And so instead, we would say things like, let's explore what happened to your compliance this week, right? And so it's very hard to not say why. So let's explore why this might be happening, which again is not directly asking why, or again, you ask them for how was your compliance this week, and they're going to say it wasn't good. What do you think led to that, etc. So you're still getting the same information without just saying, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Now, in addition to the specific question types, we also have specific response types. So again, with these 6 responses, I would make flashcards. So we have understanding responses, probing responses, confrontational responses, evaluative responses, hostile responses, and reassuring responses. So understanding responses are the best choice to use. Again, the goal is with this interview is we want the client to do most of the talking. So this is your classic paraphrasing. It also allows you to check for understanding content and feelings. So this is, you've heard this before in any conversation or interview where somebody says, oh, that's interesting, tell me more about this. Or, can you explain this? Or, it sounds like this. And what will happen is while also providing that paraphrasing, the client can correct you if something is misunderstood or if your impression and understanding is incorrect. So this is the best choice and really lets the conversation continue to flow with the interviewee doing most of the talking. You then have your probing responses, which are similar to how you would ask a probing question in that they help clarify or gain information. Again, similar to our questions, right? We want to be non-threatening, non-judgmental, and non-directive. So again, it's just to get information. It's not good or bad. We just want, tell us more about this or clarify this. And so again, this can be using things like paraphrasing, repeating, summarizing, or rewording, where again, we want them to continue the flow, but we just need to get additional information. There's something specific that we need to know or understand. Now the next several responses are more of an advanced skill set and you just have to kind of be careful. So you have your confrontational response, which is difficult but healthy. So this is authority-laden response. And so usually this is when you're going to point out something like some cognitive dissonance or some discrepancy where if the client says something is important to them, but they've failed to act repeatedly. So again, you're going to be challenging the client, but this is an advanced skill and needs to be used very carefully. And so the book notes it's seldom used by an inexperienced interviewer, as again, this is going to be uncomfortable, and again, also has to have a very specific purpose, right? So looking at that stages of change, looking at why somebody is failing to maintain or start a change, but again, needs to be very careful. We also have evaluative responses, where the interviewer is actually making judgments about the person's behavior or responses. So again, the very thing we're trying to avoid, which is I as a dietitian, right, may have a certain relationship with food or expectations about food, and I don't want to put that onto my client or judge their behaviors using my value system. Right, so in addition to my personal value system, right, different cultural value systems, again, this is almost never helpful. And so again, we want to be careful of and not offer advice. Now, it's one thing if the client and I are collaborating on possible solutions. So if the client tells me they want to exercise more, but I've never really exercised before, what are some types of exercise I could do, then I can provide examples. Have you considered this or this or this? Or I could refer you to a personal trainer who could discuss some safe and healthy options. But again, I'm not saying, well, you should be doing this and you should be eating differently and you should care more about this, right? That's not very helpful. And again, it's one thing to exchange information and educate the patient. Again, I don't want to offer advice and tell them what to do. Now, we said that we wanted to be careful with a confrontational response, and that's an advanced skill set. And so instead, if it's done incorrectly or the frustration boils over, you're going to get a hostile response. And so this is not healthy or appropriate. And so this is when the professional's anger or frustration becomes uncontrolled, right? So you've boiled over, I'm just so mad. This patient just won't listen. It's so obvious what they need to do. They just need to exercise. They just need to change their diet. Why don't they listen to me? Like, it's just so frustrating, right? And then you have an inappropriate response. And so this may lead to an antagonism or humiliation of a client. You know, you've told me you care about this. You come in here, you're still fat, you haven't lost any weight. I don't think you even care about this. You're just wasting our time, right? And that's not how you would speak to a client, right? That's completely inappropriate. And so, of course, this may result in a client retaliating. This is going to, of course, lead to a damaged professional relationship. So again, this is completely inappropriate. And again, this is really what happens when you have a confrontational response gone completely wrong. Now then, we also have our reassuring responses. And so when we talk about some of the different counseling theories, one of the things we'll talk about is unconditional positive regard, which is an entire counseling-based theory. It's an overarching theory that, and we'll talk more about it, about how patients are to be accepted as they are. That being said, there's a fine line that there's a needle we need to thread, a fine line we need to walk, in that you are okay in who you are as a person, right? So again, this is that fine line of, we're not fat shaming anyone, right? You are okay as who you are as a person, but this is not good for your health. And so what we don't want to do, and so this reassuring response is telling them not to worry. So I know you tried hard, I know you failed, it's okay. We all fail. That's part of the stages of change, is we expect people to have lapses. It's okay. You'll do better next time. But if we do this excessively, the patient doesn't really take the problem seriously, right? They kind of believe that it doesn't exist. It's not that big of a deal. I don't need to really work that hard. And so then it becomes difficult to move forward and actually make progress on this, as we just keep patting their hand saying, well, we can do it tomorrow and tomorrow. And it's not a big deal, when it is still having a significant health impact. So again, it can be used, but needs to be used appropriately and not excessively. And so then, right, when you're closing out an interview, you want to end on a positive note. You want to review the purpose. So again, I thank you for coming in today. We've gotten all this information so we can plan what we're going to do going forward, or I can use this to assess and make the best possible interventions for you so I can help you. You want to summarize the points or the goals or what you've gone through. So again, here's where the high points, this is what we have identified, this is what we're going to work on in the future. And again, following up with the time, place, and purpose for future contacts. So again, if it's employment, you're going to hear from us next week. You're going to hear from HR to let you know if we're moving forward or not. If it's a counseling session with a client, then again, we're going to meet this time in 2 weeks. In the meantime, work on this, keep a record. When we meet, we're going to be discussing X, Y, and Z. So that being all said, I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.